After the first Hùng King dynasty laid the foundational stones of the Van Long community, the Second Hùng King dynasty emerged as a crucial transitional phase, one in which ancient Vietnamese society began to move beyond its initial formative state and enter a period of consolidation and expansion. If the first dynasty was the age of awakening communal consciousness, then the second dynasty was the age of reinforcement and diffusion. During this stage, the inhabitants of Van Long were no longer merely learning how to live together, but had grown accustomed to existing within a shared social order. The experiences of water management, agriculture, and communal organization accumulated from previous generations began to demonstrate clear effectiveness. People came to understand more deeply the rhythms of rivers and seasons and the intrinsic relationship between nature and the survival of the entire community. The Second Hùng King dynasty unfolded against the backdrop of a growing population as Lac Viet communities expanded along the Red River, the Ma River, and the Ca River basins. The living space was no longer confined to a single ritual center, but spread into multiple interconnected settlement clusters. This very expansion required social structures to become more defined and stable. At the organizational level, the role of the Lac Tiong became more prominent than in the first dynasty. Whereas earlier they were primarily figures of prestige within their communities, they now gradually assumed the function of true administrators, responsible for coordinating labor, allocating land, organizing defense, and maintaining internal order. Nevertheless, their authority remained non-coercive, grounded in trust and in their ability to ensure stable livelihoods for the people. The Hùng King in the Second Dynasty was no longer solely the supreme spiritual symbol, but increasingly demonstrated a coordinating role on a broader scale. Major rituals were still presided over by the king, yet alongside them emerged more practical gatherings among local leaders. From this point onward, the notion of common affairs among multiple regions began to take shape, signaling a transition from loosely linked communities to a more organized confederation. Economically, wet rice agriculture during the Second Hùng King dynasty reached a higher level of stability. Farming techniques were standardized through generational experience. The timing of sowing seedlings, methods of water control, and the construction of embankments to retain water in the fields. These practices significantly reduced the uncertainty of harvests compared to earlier periods. In certain areas, food surpluses began to appear, enabling exchanges among communities. Alongside agriculture, handicrafts developed more distinctly. Bronze casting, pottery making, and textile weaving were no longer limited to meeting basic survival needs, but began to exhibit specialization. Bronze objects were not merely tools of labor, they also carried symbolic value, used in rituals and exchanged between communities as markers of prestige and alliance. It was precisely during the Second Dynasty that the material culture of Van Long acquired a clearer identity. Decorative motifs appeared with increasing frequency on everyday objects, reflecting the growth of symbolic thinking. Images associated with water, birds, the sun, and communal human activities reveal a direct continuation of the symbolic system of the First Dynasty, now expressed with greater richness and confidence. Spiritual life in the Second Hùng King dynasty also underwent important transformations. Whereas earlier, rituals were primarily focused on securing survival, they now also served to maintain social order. Seasonal festivals became occasions to reaffirm relationships among communities and to reinforce shared memories of origins and ancestors. Ancestor worship continued to expand from the family sphere to communal and intercommunal levels. Figures associated with land reclamation and past leaders of great merit gradually remembered as common forebears. The image of the Hùng King became increasingly sacralized, not merely as the ruler of the present, but as the embodiment of a line of authority stretching from the past into the future. Within this context, legends assumed a more significant role. Stories about origins, land reclamation, and the relationship between humans and nature were retold with greater intention, serving to educate younger generations about social order and communal values. At this stage, legend no longer answered only the question, "Where do we come from?" but implicitly addressed, "How should we live together?" The Second Hùng King Dynasty was also the period in which a clearer sense of collective defense began to emerge. Population expansion and increased interaction among communities inevitably brought about conflicts of interest. Bronze tools used in labor could also be employed to protect the community when necessary. Yet the prevailing spirit remained one of defense and preservation rather than conquest or expansion. Importantly, all of these transformations occurred gradually and continuously. There was no sharp rupture between the first and second dynasties. On the contrary, the Second Hùng King Dynasty stands as evidence of the ancient Vietnamese society's capacity for self-adjustment and endogenous development. What was established in the initial phase was not replaced, but reinforced, expanded, and deepened. Looking back at the Second Hùng King Dynasty, one does not encounter resounding military triumphs or dramatic upheavals. Yet it is precisely this quietness that signals a society in the process of maturation. The community had learned to maintain order, accumulate experience, and transmit to subsequent generations a more stable structure upon which further development could unfold. Within the continuum of the 18 Hùng King dynasties, the Second Dynasty functioned as a solid bridge, linking the fragile beginnings of the First Dynasty with the more complex stages that followed. And upon this bridge, the identity of ancient Vietnam was strengthened, not through dramatic leaps, but through endurance, adaptability, and communal cohesion. Qualities that would accompany the Vietnamese people throughout the long course of their history.
When the Second Hùng King Dynasty entered a period of stability, the most noticeable feature was not sudden change, but the deep settling of social order. People no longer lived with the mindset that each season is a trial of survival, but began to believe that the world around them could be understood, anticipated, and to some extent controlled. This belief fundamentally altered how ancient Vietnamese people perceived themselves and their community. The living space during the Second Dynasty not only expanded geographically, but also became more clearly structured. Settlements were typically established on land high enough to avoid major floods, yet close to water sources. This choice was no longer based solely on individual experience, but evolved into shared communal knowledge passed down through generations. Gradually, these familiar lands were defined, places where descendants were born, grew up, and formed bonds as part of a collective identity. Along with this development, the concept of communal land became increasingly distinct. Wet rice fields, alluvial plains, and hunting forests were no longer regarded as ownerless spaces, but were protected and allocated according to unwritten communal conventions. It was during the Second Hùng King Dynasty that these conventions gained long-term stability, fostering a sense of fairness and order, key factors that helped society avoid internal conflict. This stability allowed people to devote more time to activities not directly tied to survival. Gatherings, festivals, and seasonal rituals became more frequent and larger in scale. These occasions were not merely opportunities to pray for good harvests or give thanks to the spirits, but also spaces where the community could tell its own story, recalling shared origins, past hardships, and the roles of different groups within the social whole. In this context, rituals gradually lost their spontaneous character and became standardized. There were fixed times of the year for ceremonies, familiar offerings used in worship, and designated individuals who assumed ritual leadership. Through repetition, rituals became embedded in collective memory, allowing each new generation to feel that they were stepping into a flow that had existed for a very long time. The Hùng King in the Second Dynasty became increasingly integrated into this ritual system. The king was not only a representative of secular authority, but also a mediator between humans and the sacred realm. By presiding over major rituals, the king symbolically ensured that social order was sanctioned by the spirits and the ancestors. From this point onward, political power and spiritual authority merged, creating a distinctive form of leadership characteristic of ancient Vietnamese society. Alongside the king, the Loc Tung and Loc Ho assumed increasingly important intermediary roles. They both implemented communal decisions and conveyed the king's will to individual settlements. However, this relationship was not based on absolute command, but on negotiation and prestige. It reflected a society that valued consensus over coercion. In everyday life, the division of labor also became more clear. No longer did everyone perform the same tasks. Some specialized in wet rice cultivation, others excelled in hunting, while others were skilled in bronze casting, pottery making, and textile weaving. Although strict social classes had not yet formed, society had begun to recognize the value of specialization and cooperation. This specialization stimulated more active exchange between communities. Rice, tools, ornaments, and handicrafts were traded not only to meet material needs, but also to strengthen social ties. These exchanges carried with them stories, customs, and experiences, contributing to a more unified Van Lang culture across a broad geographic space. At a deeper level, the Second Hùng King Dynasty witnessed the emergence of early historical consciousness. People began to distinguish more clearly between the time of the ancestors and our own time. Stories about earlier generations were no longer told merely to explain the world, but to situate the present within a temporal continuum. This marked an important transition from purely mythological thinking toward an initial sense of history. Legends during this period thus took on a new function. They did not only recount miraculous events, but also embedded moral and social norms, solidarity, loyalty to the community, and respect for ancestors and nature. Through these narratives, younger generations were taught how to live in accordance with the accepted social order. Also, during the Second Dynasty, the relationship between humans and nature came to be viewed in a more balanced way. Nature was no longer seen solely as something to fear or conquer, but as an entity that required respect and harmonization. Rituals associated with water, mountains, and forests reflected the understanding that communal prosperity depended on maintaining harmony with the surrounding environment. The sense of collective defense continued to be strengthened while retaining a strong communal character. Protecting land, water sources, and crops was regarded as a shared responsibility. Tools used in labor could, when necessary, become instruments of defense, yet the primary objective remained the preservation of life rather than the expansion of power. Viewed as a whole, the Second Hùng King Dynasty was the period in which ancient Vietnamese society learned how to maintain harvests, maintain order, maintain memory, and maintain bonds among people. This was a social skill no less important than the ability to pioneer new lands or overcome natural challenges. Thanks to this capacity for maintenance, the core values of the Van Lang community did not dissipate over time. Instead, they were accumulated, refined, and passed down to subsequent dynasties. When the Third Hùng King Dynasty and those that followed emerged, they did not begin from nothing, but inherited a social foundation that had been tested and proven across generations. The Second Hùng King Dynasty was therefore not a glamorous chapter of history, but a foundational one. It demonstrates that history is shaped not only by dramatic events, but also by quiet periods in which people learn to live together sustainably.
and it was precisely within this quietness that the identity of ancient Vietnam was forged, resilient, adaptive, and deeply rooted in communal cohesion.